Well, it's certainly not for everyone. At-home births are now widely accepted in society, but how do you feel about at-home funerals? WGBH News reporter Mostue has more on this small but growing movement.
The dining room table where DENALI DELMAR and her two sons just celebrated Thanksgiving is also where they waked her husband, Bruce, after he died 2 years ago.
He died in the living room on the bed that we got from hospice, and we carried his body in here, and we put towels probably on top of the dining room table, and we turned it and put it against that wall and washed him.
Bruce and DENALI had been married for 30 years, so after he died of pancreatic cancer, DENALI couldn't bear to part with her husband's body.
You know, he's mine. I was not letting anyone who didn't love him touch him. You know, we wanted to do it all.
And do it all they did, including driving his body to the crematorium. It's perfectly legal, and it's inexpensive.
We know what the conventional burial and embalming and funeral home costs are. That's out there. It's $8, $10, $12, $15, $20,000 is not unheard of. So if people want to really look at that, they don't have the money, or they just want to spend their money in other ways, this process is so personal and unique, and very gently pull them out.
Using a live model, at-home funeral guide Peg Lorenz teaches a class in Groton, showing how to care for a deceased loved one, starting with a cold room.
I would be really careful after that first time of moving them around. Try not to move them that much.
CORINNE Renaud recently attended an at-home funeral for her uncle. She came to the workshop to learn more.
It's nice to be able to spend time with the body, even though the spirit is already gone. It's just the shell. But, yeah, you can still grieve for yourself.
And grieving is at the center of this movement, a movement that's really a return to past traditions. And for DENALI DELMAR, it was an uplifting experience.
This room is all about sharing food and drink and celebrating life. So even though this was where the funeral was, this is the space where life happens.
Mostue has been reporting this story for the past month. She joins us now to share more of what she's learned. So, Ann, this is interesting because there's a big difference between at-home funerals and do-it-yourself. At-home has kind of been going on for a long time.
Right, exactly. I mean, a very long time. And it's important to understand that it's not at-home funeral versus funeral home in this case. You can hire a funeral home for a la carte services. In many cases, they're willing to transport a body to or from a home or a church. So,
But are more people trying to do it themselves, all themselves, like DENALI did?
Yes, and that's the idea behind the movement. And I think it comes down to really two criteria. One is comfort level with the idea of handling the body of a loved one. And then the other component is advanced planning, and whether you've had a conversation about your plans with your family, or whether they've had that conversation with you, and what you're comfortable with, what you're all comfortable with.
Who do you think this is catching on with? Who's doing it?
Yeah, it's a good question. That's what I wondered, and that's one of the reasons I went to the workshop. The workshop was almost exclusively middle-aged white women, and that's also the demographic of where it was held, I think, in part. But there were a couple of men, and I think people were there largely because they knew someone or they themselves were thinking about their own funerals.
That's interesting to me that it's women. Or I'd like to bring in now Josh Slocum. He's the executive director of the Funeral Consumers Alliance, a nonprofit advocacy group. I think, Josh, we were all surprised to learn from Ann that this is perfectly legal. And it does vary state to state. Your association is in Vermont, but does it widely vary in legal systems?
Yeah, in most states, with the exception of 8 or 9 states, it's perfectly legal to do the entire process yourself, from the paperwork to the transportation to caring for the body. You don't have to do all those things, but you can. And even in the states where there are legal impediments to doing all the funeral, where you might have to hire a funeral home, it's always legal to decide when you're ready to let go. So if, you know, like someone like Denali's husband has died at home, if you want goodbye time with that person, you don't have to call the funeral home right away. You can have people come over, or you can take time yourself. You get to decide when you're ready to let go.
What about things like embalming or cremation? Can you do that yourself?
No, those are the two things that, and honestly, the people who are interested in this, I have never actually had a request for instruction on DIY embalming. What people are doing when they have a home wake is very, very traditional. As you said a minute ago, you were surprised to hear that it's legal. People should know, just 100 years ago, our great-grandparents were doing this as a matter of course. We have become so quickly distanced from death that we automatically assume, is this okay to do? Think about it this way. It's a natural extension of what we've done with hospice. More people are dying at home in the comfort of their home with professional help. If you have cared for a loved one in their declining years, you already know how to do what people are doing when they do a home and a family-directed funeral.
Well, and you called around to figure out who was in charge of this, what kind of regulations, and you didn't get very far.
Right, no, I called the Department of Health, Department of Vital Statistics, the CDC, the board that oversees funeral directors, and the medical examiner's office. And no one wanted to comment on the record about this. Many people had never even heard of at-home funerals.
Or do it yourself.
Or do it yourself. And the State Department of Health website has some guidelines for handling a dead body, but they don't call it an at-home funeral. They don't give it any sort of name. It's interesting, and many offices referred me to another office saying, well, they would know about this. So it's really sort of an under-the-radar practice, and you know, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just the situation it is right now.
But it seems to me like, I mean, not to get too graphic, but when you're dealing with bodily fluids and that kind of thing, it could be blood or excrement or urine or something like that. I mean, is there a hygiene issue here as well? Is there a concern about some of that?
To the same extent that there's a concern when you're changing your baby's diaper or when you're caring for a sick relative at home. People do not become, when somebody dies, they don't become a biological ticking time bomb, right? There are very, very rarely any health concerns. The only time I could imagine that this would be, well, people will say, well, but there are bodily fluids. Well, there already are at home anyway in any family situation. And if a doctor has not said this person is infectious and is quarantined in life, then there isn't going to be a problem after death.
How long can you keep a body in a home without being embalmed, without it starting to rot, frankly?
The practicalities of dealing with a body, this is general advice. There will be exceptions. But generally, if you keep the person at home for 1, 2, even 3 days in a reasonably cool room, 70 degrees, 65 degrees, if there's concern about that, you can put ice packs under the body in the bed. You can open the window in the wintertime. You can turn the air conditioner on. Generally, that's fine. People are very surprised to learn that when you have an at-home funeral, it's not what you think. It's not like an episode of The Walking Dead, right? It's really much, much more peaceful than that. I've been to funerals at commercial funeral homes with embalming, and I have seen natural people cared for at home, and there's really nothing frightening about it.
Well, the one thing that people have to do, though, they have to get a formal death certificate, so they have to call somebody in right away.
Right. You do need a death certificate from a doctor or a specially licensed nurse, yes.
How did you feel about it, Anne? Did you feel more comfortable with it after you had kind of seen some of it?
Yeah, I did. Peg Lorenz had approached me with the story and invited me to her workshop, and I was very surprised and skeptical because I'd never heard of anything like it. And I'm very open-minded about the idea. It's certainly a natural part of the grieving process for the people who choose to do this. I'm lucky enough not to know anyone who's ill right now, so I haven't seriously thought about it.
But obviously you've seen more and more of this, Josh?
You can't really put statistics on it. There's no agency that collects where people have funerals, right? But I've been doing work with Funeral Consumers Alliance for 10 years, and I have seen an explosion in interest. When I first took this job, there were maybe 2 or 3 women in the country who made a specialty out of doing what Peg Lorenz does. There's a national organization now with hundreds of members. So I don't think it's beyond a small minority, but the interest is definitely there.
All right. Josh Slocum, Anne Mostue, thanks a lot.
Thank you.